Hey guys, tonight we begin with the faint glow of torchlight flickering against stone walls, a fire crackling softly in a distant hearth, and the solemn hush of a castle preparing to wake. The year is somewhere in the shadowy cradle of the Middle Ages, and you, yes, you, are about to step into a life of unimaginable power and equally unimaginable responsibility. But beware. In a world where crowns weigh more than heads can bear and trust is as rare as a warm bath, you might not make it out alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first breath of dawn creeps through the narrow arrow-slit windows of the royal chamber. Outside, a low fog coils over the castle's ramparts, clinging to mossy stones like the ghosts of yesterday's regrets. Inside, silence hangs like thick velvet, punctuated only by the soft pop of a hearth fire and the distant toll of a bell calling monks to early prayer. And there you lie, nestled in a bed so large it could accommodate half the nobility, draped in pelts and embroidered silks that could pay a town's yearly taxes. The mattress groans as you stir, a slab of oak and feather-stuffed opulence that still somehow manages to be uncomfortable in the most regal of ways. You're not just anyone. Tonight, you are King America Valamir, or Queen Elira, if that suits your taste better. Either way, you're not simply waking up in a castle. You're waking up at the very peak of the medieval food chain. But don't smile just yet. Royalty comes with strings, ropes, and occasionally nooses. Every move you make, every sigh you breathe is watched by advisors, enemies, servants, and an entire kingdom trained to read omens in your breakfast choice. The first knock on the chamber door is impossibly gentle, a rhythm designed not to wake, but to suggest the idea of waking. And then it comes again, slightly firmer. The door creaks open, and in steps a man carrying a folded cloth, a basin of warm water, and a level of professional awkwardness unmatched outside of medieval hygiene. Ah yes, the groom of the stool, the most unfortunately named and alarmingly intimate of your courtiers. His job? To help you with your morning bathroom routine. Yes, help. Because wiping is not a royal responsibility, it's a royal vulnerability. And in the world of court politics, the person who sees your rear end is someone you need to trust more than your general. You try not to think about that as you sit up. Layers of linen and wool shift like tectonic plates. Your robe is presented to you with the kind of reverence normally reserved for sacred relics. And as the groom bows himself out, another parade enters. Enter the royal dressers, tailors, page boys, and fabric wranglers whose sole purpose is to turn you into a living tapestry. Today, it's purple, because purple says power, because purple dye comes from crushed sea snails and smells like failure in chemistry class. But also because purple costs so much, only someone with divine right and serious cash could afford to smell that weird in public. They layer your garments in a process resembling medieval lasagna. Undergarments, hose, doublets, tunics, cloaks, jewelry, insignia, and finally your crown. Heavy, bejeweled, and strategically uncomfortable. It's less of a hat and more of a metal reminder that your neck belongs to history now. And if you're Queen Elira, your routine isn't any lighter. Your ladies-in-waiting descend on you like vultures with hairbrushes. They twist, they tug, they braid your hair into elaborate configurations that double as architectural wonders. Your corset squeezes your ribs into submission, while your gown, which weighs as much as a modest sheep, requires 2 attendants and divine intervention to fasten. Once dressed, you are escorted down a hallway that whispers. Every footstep echoes, every tapestry watches, and somewhere beneath the perfume and powder, there's the undeniable scent of fear. Because to be royal is to always be performing, and the show must begin with piety. Your private chapel is smaller than the grand cathedral, but no less imposing. Candles flicker in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows over grim-faced saints and the painted eyes of angels. You kneel, side by side with your royal spouse, and recite the morning offices. Latin syllables roll off your tongue like ritualized sighs. It doesn't matter if you understand them. It matters that you say them, because the people believe you were chosen by God. And if they stop believing that, well, History has several creative suggestions for what happens next. You rise from prayer, legs stiff from kneeling on cold stone, back aching beneath the weight of ceremonial velvet. But there's no time to stretch. Outside the chapel, a courtier bows so low you worry his spine won't survive the encounter. The day's schedule awaits, and it's less a list and more a gauntlet. You're escorted toward the solar, a private chamber where important documents, dignitaries, and disaster all arrive uninvited. On the way, you pass courtiers pretending not to stare. Their smiles are polite, their eyes are hungry. Everyone at court has a secret. Some are planning marriages, others, murders. A few are simply wondering if you'll trip on your hem and give them something to gossip about over mead. By the time you reach your chair, an actual throne, because subtlety died long before your great-grandfather, you're already exhausted. But now comes the real challenge, pretending you're not. The chamberlain presents a scroll. Your steward mumbles about taxes. The bishop frowns about sin. A messenger from the border insists there's been a minor rebellion. Minor rebellions, by the way, are never minor. They're just rebellions that haven't ruined breakfast yet. You nod solemnly, issue decisions, and pray you remembered the correct cousin's name. One mistake, and you'll be the subject of a very passive-aggressive poem from the court minstrel. And that minstrel? He's popular. People still hum the tune he wrote about your father's unfortunate jousting accident. Time drags, then suddenly disappears. A bell rings for the midday meal. You're herded into the great hall, a vaulted chamber filled with wood smoke, clinking goblets, and a noise level just short of actual warfare. A long table stretches beneath banners depicting your family crest, some mythical beast with too many limbs because heraldry is weird. Servants rush past, bearing trenchers of meat, flagons of wine, and exactly one vegetable boiled into existential despair. You eat carefully, no bones, no choking, no spills. Every bite is diplomacy, every glance is politics. And then, just when you think you can swallow one more spoonful without consequence, a voice from the end of the hall announces an arrival. She enters like a storm in silk, not Eleanor, not yet. Tonight, her name is Elira, Queen Elira of House Merovan. Beautiful, yes. But more than that, intelligent, strategic, and terrifyingly competent. A woman who learned early that power was not given to her. It had to be taken and kept with both hands. At 15, Elira had married Prince Louis of Gavain. You remember him. The awkward, earnest boy who quoted scripture at parties and once tried to outlaw jesters for excessive giggling. It was a match made in dynastic heaven and emotional purgatory. They never quite clicked. Elira wanted debate. Louis wanted silence. She craved music, hawking, and the glittering chaos of court. He preferred prayer and parchment. Still, they were crowned together when Louis' father died unexpectedly. Two teenagers suddenly wearing the weight of a kingdom. It was like handing a cathedral to a pair of squirrels. But Elira played the part. She bore children. She wore the jewels. She even joined Louis on a crusade, a military expedition most people thought required chainmail, not a lady's touch. And she didn't just go. She led. In 1147, while most queens stayed safely cloistered in castles, Elira rode at the head of her own troops. Armor glinting, hair braided like a battle banner, her presence alone scandalized half of Christendom and inspired the other half to write poetry they definitely couldn't share in church. It didn't end well. The crusade, that is. They didn't capture Jerusalem. They didn't reclaim anything except sunburns and sorrow. And Louis? He came back more pious than ever. Elira came back furious. Their marriage had always been an arranged sword dance over lava. Now it had cooled into distant frost. By 1152, they sought annulment. Officially, it was because they were related by blood, a church-sanctioned way of saying, we tried, but no. Unofficially, Elira just couldn't bear another sermon at breakfast. The Pope nodded. The papers were signed. And Queen Elira? She was 30 free and very much not planning to stay single. 2 months. That's all it took. While most queens might retire to a countryside estate and knit their grievances into tapestries, Queen Elira of Merovan made a different choice. She remarried. But not just anyone. His name was Henry of Orleans, 18 years old and already a duke. Sharp-eyed, fire-tempered, and ambitious enough to make a lion nervous. Their union was part whirlwind romance, part chess move, with the board being all of Western Europe. When Elira said, I do, To Henry, she brought with her a dowry so vast it looked less like a wedding gift and more like a hostile acquisition. Her lands stretched across nearly a third of what we now call France. Combined with Henry's holdings, their union created a geopolitical beast the French crown couldn't ignore. It was less of a marriage and more of a continental earthquake. And the ground hadn't even stopped shaking, because in 1154, 2 years after they married, Henry pressed his claim to the English throne. King Stephen, his distant cousin and inconvenient obstacle, had finally run out of time, or heirs, and Henry, now with Elira by his side and an army at his back, crossed the Channel not just as a duke, but as a king in waiting. When he was crowned King Henry II of England, Elira became queen once more, but this time she wasn't playing by anyone else's rules. This wasn't France. This wasn't a pious teenager and crusade-shattered dreams. This was power, raw, sprawling, English power, and Elira wielded it like someone who had once been denied it and never forgot the taste. The Angevin Empire, as it would come to be called, wasn't technically an empire, but don't tell that to anyone who lived in it. It stretched from the lowlands of Scotland to the peaks of the Pyrenees, from Irish marshes to the edge of Burgundy. A patchwork of languages, loyalties, and very confused tax collectors. And at its center, two rulers, both brilliant, both headstrong, both incapable of compromise. To the outside world, they looked like a golden pair, young, attractive, and commanding. But behind the smiles and state dinners was a marriage as explosive as the territories they governed. Still, they made it work, or rather, they made heirs, a lot of them. Elira gave birth to 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters. And among them were names that would echo through history, like war drums, Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, whose childhood games involved diplomacy, daggers, and the occasional small rebellion. But back to the marriage. At first, things seemed stable enough. Henry was busy expanding the reach of English law, building castles, and occasionally fighting with his bishops. Elira managed court life with the finesse of a seasoned diplomat and the authority of someone who knew her own worth. But beneath the veneer of harmony, cracks had started to show. Henry, never one to be content with what he had, began collecting mistresses like they were regional tax offices. He sired illegitimate children, some acknowledged, some hidden behind titles like ward or that suspiciously royal-looking page. Elira, for all her power, found herself increasingly isolated. Henry restricted her movements, pulled her influence from certain courts, and treated her advisors with thinly veiled disdain. But Elira wasn't the sort to fade into embroidered tapestries and history footnotes. She pushed back, quietly at first, then with the force of a woman who had led an army to the Holy Land and didn't particularly care for her husband's latest favorite. Their arguments turned cold, then tactical, then dangerously silent. By 1173, the powder keg finally ignited. It began with whispers of discontent, whispers of sons growing impatient, whispers that Queen Elira, now more queen in name than in influence, was no longer content to smile politely from the shadows of her husband's ever-expanding ego. King Henry had grown more controlling with each passing year. His reforms were sweeping, his justice ruthless, his ambition insatiable. And while Elira had once matched him wit for wit, crown for crown, he had slowly, deliberately pushed her to the edges of courtly life. Her letters were monitored, her movements restricted, her political alliances, carefully cultivated over decades, were quietly dismantled. But Elira was not the type to fade quietly into the background. Her sons, especially the eldest 3, Henry, the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, had their own grievances. Promised lands, promised titles, promised autonomy, none of which their father seemed inclined to actually deliver. Instead, Henry micromanaged their futures with the same iron grip he used to run the Angevin Empire. So in 1173, the spark caught. The sons revolted, and Elira, long underestimated, added fuel to the fire. This was no simple family spat. This was a coordinated uprising against the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. Henry, the young king, called on allies in France. Richard and Geoffrey raised banners in Aquitaine and Brittany. And behind it all, orchestrating like a maestro of political theater, was their mother. She provided the strategy, she provided the resources, and perhaps most importantly, she provided the legitimacy. A queen turned rebel, a mother turned revolutionary. The empire erupted, From Normandy to Anjou, from the Welsh borders to the Pyrenees, castles changed hands, alliances shifted, and battle lines were drawn on parchment and fields alike. Henry II found himself besieged not by foreign kings, but by his own blood, and yet he prevailed. Henry's response was swift and unrelenting. He crushed the rebellion in stages, turning sons against one another, peeling away support with bribes, threats, and siege engines. The nobility who had joined the revolt were either bought back or broken. By the end of the year, the young king had surrendered. Richard and Geoffrey were subdued. The dream of dividing the empire among brothers was over. But for Elira, the price was more personal. She was captured. No royal trial, no show of mercy. Just a quiet order, a locked door, and exile in her own empire. Henry had his wife imprisoned, not in chains, but in castles. Elegant cages, to be sure, but cages all the same. She was moved from one to another over the years, Salisbury, Winchester, Sarum, and others, each a fortress, each a reminder that even a queen could be rendered powerless with the right locks and loyal guards. 16 years. That's how long she remained a prisoner. From the rebellion in 1173 until Henry's death in 1189. 16 birthdays, 16 winters, 16 times watching the seasons shift through narrow windows while the world outside changed. And while Elira sat in silent confinement, her family unraveled. Henry the young king died in 1183, not in battle, but in illness, dysentery while on campaign. His death was sudden, brutal, and unresolved. Elira received word of it in a letter that took days to reach her. No chance to mourn, no farewell, just news carried by a trembling hand and a bowed head. Geoffrey, her charming middle son, met his end in 1186. A jousting accident in Paris, a fall, a stomp, a fractured skull. Gone, just like that. Another child buried. Another grief endured behind locked doors. Henry II, meanwhile, carried on. He grieved, but he ruled. He aged, but he ruled. And slowly, his empire began to crumble, not from the might of foreign powers, but from within. His last years were marked by suspicion, paranoia, and loneliness. And then, in 1189, he died. Defeated not on the battlefield, but in spirit, betrayed by his last surviving son, Richard, the Lionheart, the favorite. Richard's first act as king? He opened the door. After 16 years of confinement, Queen Elira was free, but she did not step out as a broken woman or a fragile relic of better days. She stepped out like a queen reborn, tall, proud, unbent. The courtiers who greeted her bowed lower than protocol required. The servants dared not meet her eyes. And the nobles, they whispered, about the gleam in her gaze, about the quiet smile that said, "Yes, I remember everything." At 67, Elira returned not just to public life, but to power. Because Richard, true to his adventurous nature, was already planning his crusade. And someone had to rule in his absence, someone experienced, someone respected, someone feared, someone like her. Power doesn't rust, not when it's held by someone who knows exactly what to do with it. Queen Elira's return to the royal court wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. At 67, she didn't just take her seat beside the throne, she occupied it. Not as a queen consort, not as a dowager, but as regent, ruler in all but name, the steel in the velvet cloak of the empire. While her son, King Richard the Lionheart, prepared for yet another crusade, the third this time, Elira took the reins of government. Richard trusted her more than any advisor, bishop, or baron, and with good reason. She had outlasted rebellions, outmaneuvered monarchs, and outwitted nearly every noble who had ever tried to cross her. Her regency was no symbolic role. She handled petitions, negotiated with lords, managed finances, coordinated Richard's ransom when he was famously captured on his way back from the Holy Land. While the world panicked at the thought of a king in chains, Elira calmly organized one of the largest fundraisers in medieval history. Monasteries coughed up gold, towns taxed themselves willingly. Even the nobles who hated her sent money because they knew what she could do if they didn't. But Elira's strength wasn't just in her titles, it was in her memory. She remembered betrayals, names, dates, who had stood by her, and who had looked the other way during her imprisonment. She didn't seek vengeance exactly, but certain doors remained closed to certain people, and some careers quietly ceased to exist. Yet she wasn't without mercy. Those who proved loyal earned her protection. Her court became known as a place of order and surprising fairness, especially for women. She brought educated noblewomen into her circle, encouraged correspondence, even oversaw diplomatic marriages with a careful balance of affection and calculation. For nearly a decade, Elira ruled in Richard's stead, and when he returned, sunburnt, battle-scarred, and deeply in debt, he found a realm not just intact, but thriving. But peace never lingers long in royal circles. In 1199, Richard died, an arrow wound, poorly treated, a siege he didn't need to attend. His pride, as always, had led him into glory and out of time. And with that, the throne passed once again. To John. Yes, that John, Elira's youngest surviving son, the one history remembers as reckless, scheming, and woefully unfit. But at the time, the choice wasn't so obvious. There was another contender, her grandson, Arthur of Brittany, young, charismatic, and arguably more rightful in his claim. But he was also too young. Elira had seen what child kings brought: manipulation, instability, and war. Arthur, for all his promise, would be torn apart by the nobility, used, discarded, or worse. So Elira chose John. It wasn't love, it was logic. And once again, she stepped into the fray. At 77, she didn't just endorse her son's claim, she enforced it, personally. When a key region resisted John's coronation, Elira mounted a horse, donned a half-suit of ceremonial armor, and led a force to suppress the rebellion. Her presence alone broke the enemy's will. The sight of a silver-haired queen atop a warhorse, flanked by knights who had served under 3 kings, was not something easily forgotten. Whispers spread. Is she mortal? Some said. Or just really annoyed? Said others. But Elira didn't need divine status. She had experience, reputation, and the weight of legacy on her side. And once John was crowned, she stepped back, slowly, gracefully. She knew her work was done. Elira retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a quiet, sacred place nestled in the soft hills of western France. But even in retreat, she remained the center of gravity. Pilgrims came not to see relics, but to glimpse the woman who had outlived 2 kings, mothered monarchs, and ruled an empire. She died in 1204 at the age of 82. Few mourned her publicly. Monarchs rarely get that kind of send-off. But the world felt her absence like the sudden silence after a thunderstorm. She was buried in the abbey she'd chosen. Not alone, but beside both of her husbands, Louis of Gavon and Henry of Orleans. History often leaves complicated footnotes. Elira made sure hers would be carved in stone. A queen in life, a legend in death. And now the castle grows quiet. The iron torch brackets are cold. The last scroll is sealed. The courtiers have long since lowered their eyes, and somewhere beyond the abbey walls, the wind brushes the stones of Fontevraud like a hand reaching back through time. Elira is gone, but not in the way most queens disappear. Not into footnotes, not into the background of someone else's glory, not beneath the shadow of her sons or the memory of her husbands. No, Elira remains. Buried in stone, yes, but also in stories, in ledgers, in royal decrees signed with her name, in treaties that bore her fingerprints and outlasted wars, in laws that governed generations, and in the legend of a woman who refused to become silent just because history expected her to be. What does it mean to rule for so long, to love kings, birth kings, and bury kings? To endure betrayal from the man you married and rebellion from the sons you raised? To ride into battle in your 70s when others your age can barely mount a stair? It means you've become more than a queen, you've become a force. Elira wasn't perfect. She was sharp, often cold, and could hold a grudge with the precision of a trained falcon. But perfection was never the point. Survival was, power was, and more than that, legacy. What she left behind wasn't just a kingdom. It was a blueprint for every woman told to stay silent, for every advisor who believed patience was weakness, for every ruler who dared to outlive her usefulness. She was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, her choice, not a grand cathedral, not the court of England or France, but a place of quiet strength, a place where men and women alike could rest. Her tomb, carved in limestone, shows her holding a book, not a sword, not a rosary, a book, because even in death, she was still writing the last word. She lies beside Henry, yes, the very man who imprisoned her for 16 years, and beside Richard, her lion-hearted son who freed her and gave her back her crown. It's not a family reunion, exactly. More like a truce carved in stone. People still visit those tombs. They walk the echoing halls, whispering, reading plaques, trying to imagine what it must have been like to live in her world. But they rarely imagine the truth, that she was tired, that she missed home, that some nights She probably looked out from her tower and didn't see a kingdom. She saw a woman who had paid dearly for every inch of power she held, and yet she never gave it up, because Elira understood something many rulers never do. That power once taken must be used, for peace, for order, for your children, even the ones who plot against you, for the people who cannot plot at all. And when the time comes, it must be handed off with a steady hand. Or, as she often preferred, pried from your grip only when you're truly done with it. Now, centuries later, her name may not be in every textbook. Her face isn't stamped on every coin. But her influence, it's everywhere. In the laws that say queens can rule without a king. In the histories that no longer pretend women stayed behind the throne instead of sitting on it. In the daughters who read about her and realize that they too could hold a sword, or a seal, or a kingdom. And so here we are, you, warm under your blankets, the hum of a fan somewhere in the room. Maybe you're drifting off already, maybe you're wide-eyed, still caught in the flicker of torchlight and the rustle of silk skirts brushing stone. Wherever your mind lingers, know this. You've just spent a night with a legend. Not a fairy tale, not a myth. A woman, flawed, fierce, and unforgettable. Queen Elira of Merovingian, twice crowned, never broken, she's resting now, and you should too. Because tomorrow, we begin again with new crowns, new chaos, and another soul brave enough to walk the edge of history. Sleep well. History, as it turns out, doesn't like to sit still. Even after the dust settles over tombs and the ink dries on royal decrees, the world keeps moving. And while Queen Elira of Merovingian may have drawn her final breath in 1204, the ripples she created were far from finished. Her children, her rivals, and her realm, none of them were content to simply mourn and move on. They inherited her name, her blood, and most dangerously, her unfinished business. The first to take up her mantle, whether he wanted to or not, was John. King John, yes, that King John, of Robin Hood infamy, of the Magna Carta, of royal facepalms and chronic disappointment. When he stepped onto the throne in 1199, few expected greatness, and to his credit, he lived up to that expectation remarkably well. Where Elira had ruled with patience and memory, John ruled with paranoia and pride. He inherited not just the English crown, but also the baggage of a family legacy that weighed heavier than any gold circlet. And almost immediately he began losing things. First came Normandy, then Anjou, then the respect of nearly every noble in England and half the continent. John's rule was a tragic sequel to Elira's masterpiece, a kingdom unraveling at the seams, led by a man who couldn't quite thread the needle. But what makes his reign fascinating isn't just the blunders, it's how Elira's shadow lingered. You see, every time John tried to impose his will, he was haunted by comparisons. Your mother would never have done this. Queen Elira would have handled it differently. Even his enemies invoked her name. She held this realm together while you were still soiling your tunic, sire. Ouch. And then came the moment that changed everything. Faced with a fed-up baronial class, drained treasuries, failed wars, and no Elira to clean up his mess, John was forced to sign a document that would outlive him by centuries. The Magna Carta, a charter of liberties, a blueprint for constitutional monarchy. The moment English kings began to bleed power, drop by precious drop. John didn't understand it, but Elira would have. She would have seen it not just as a defeat, but as a shift, a recalibration. Proof that even the divine right of kings could be negotiated when the ink was thick enough and the nobles desperate enough. John died a year later, poisoned by bad peaches, or dysentery, or fate. It's hard to say, but his reign was over. And Elira's influence, still growing, because the seeds she'd sown, through diplomacy, marriage, law, and sheer survival had taken root. Her daughter's descendants would marry into royal lines across Europe. Her policies lived on through the laws she helped shape. Her resilience became a whispered standard for queens to be. And her story? It refused to fade. Even in later centuries, when chroniclers tried to reduce her to just another royal wife, the records betrayed their own edits. Letters in her hand, seals stamped with her authority, battles turned by her choices. She was still there, between the lines, still shaping the world she'd left behind. And as for the rest of us, we keep watching. Because every once in a while, in the pages of some forgotten manuscript or beneath the dust of another crumbling abbey, her voice echoes back, not loud but steady, like the sound of footsteps in a marble hall, growing louder and reminding us she ruled once, and she never really stopped. Not all thrones are carved from oak and guarded by knights. Some are built from parchment, from reputation, from a gaze that makes even the most armored noble swallow his pride and adjust his tone. After Elira's death in 1204, her physical rule ended, but the shape of her power lingered in places no sword could reach. Because Elira didn't just change kingdoms, she changed possibility. And it wasn't only the daughters of kings who noticed. Across medieval Europe, noblewomen began walking with a little more certainty. Not necessarily louder, this was still a world that punished women for raising their voices, but smarter, sharper, with the quiet understanding that Elira had cracked open a door, not kicked it in, but unlocked it, and now the hinge was creaking. Start in France, where Elira's own daughter, Marie of Champagne, wasn't just surviving her husband's death. She was ruling, a countess in her own right. Fluent in Latin, poetry, politics, her court became a beacon for the emerging culture of chivalry, where knights penned awkward love poems and ladies judged tournaments like CEOs at a medieval product launch. Marie hosted writers, thinkers, crusaders, she funded abbeys, she made alliances, and every time someone asked, "Can a woman do this?" her answer was simply to keep doing it. No speech, no debate, just facts. Across the Alps in the Holy Roman Empire, there was Hildegard, not royal but a nun, an abbess. And still, she corresponded with emperors like they were pen pals, correcting their theology and scolding their politics in Latin so pristine it sparkled. She composed music, wrote visions, and challenged the idea that women's spirituality had to be soft or quiet. She wasn't quiet. Neither was Empress Matilda. Not Elira's generation, but close enough to be influenced by the same winds. Daughter of Henry I of England, Matilda had been named heir, then swiftly ignored when her cousin Stephen grabbed the throne. What followed was 2 decades of civil war, the anarchy they called it. Sounds fun, right? Matilda fought back, with armies, with law, with unrelenting persistence. She never wore the crown, but her son would, Henry II, Elira's second husband. Yes, that Henry. Which makes Matilda, wait for it, Elira's mother-in-law. And maybe that explains something, because in that tangled vine of royal bloodlines and armored egos, you can trace a line of women who didn't just endure power, they demanded it. Not always successfully, but always memorably. Their names aren't etched on every monument. They don't get the flashy biographies or Hollywood dramatizations, but they were there, in the documents, in the margins, in the sudden appearance of clauses that allowed women to hold land, manage estates, sponsor churches. Small shifts, big consequences. The ripple effect didn't stop there. In Sicily, Constance of Hauteville ruled in her own name and crowned her son as Holy Roman Emperor. In Castile, Queen Elira ruled during a brutal civil war, negotiating, commanding, and at one point excommunicating her own allies. Even in England, long after Elira's bones rested beneath stone, whispers of her survival circulated among queens who needed a precedent. And there were many, because queenship was evolving, slowly, painfully. But with every generation, the image shifted, from passive consort to political partner, from vessel for heirs to strategist, diplomat, regent. Elira had shown what was possible, and even if no one said it aloud, everyone remembered, especially the women, because the truth is, women didn't forget Elira. Men rewrote the books, men trimmed the genealogies, men decided which chronicles deserved to be copied and which scandalous stories were better left to rumor. But the women, they passed the stories on, in prayer halls and birth chambers, in girlhood games and widows' warnings. They remembered the queen who rode in armor at 70, who defied her husband, who ruled during a crusade and kept the kingdom standing. They remembered, and so do we, because when we look back now through the fog of centuries, we don't see a quiet queen tucked in a shadowy alcove. We see fire, stone, ink. We see a blueprint, and behind it, the steady hand of a woman who knew the value of waiting her turn, then taking it. Let's talk about sons, not the kind you read about in chivalric romances, flawless, obedient, gloriously photogenic in chainmail. No. Let's talk about real sons, especially the ones Queen Elira left behind. Because ruling an empire is one thing. Raising future rulers? That's a whole different battlefield. And make no mistake, Elira fought both. When she died until 1204, the realm did not fall silent. The nobles didn't gather in perfect order. The kingdoms didn't unite in shared mourning. No, what followed was exactly what you'd expect when a master tactician exits stage left and leaves behind several slightly cracked heirlooms with swords. The first heir, Richard, the Lionheart, her favorite, her Crusader king, the man who preferred horses to politics and sieges to sitting still. Richard had ruled England for nearly a decade by the time Elira passed, but he'd spent more of it abroad than at home. He was brave. He was strategic. He was occasionally reckless to the point of poetic. But Elira had always believed in him, not because he was perfect, he wasn't, but because, unlike his brothers, Richard never underestimated her. He listened. He trusted her judgment. He freed her from prison. He let her rule in his name. And when he marched off to the Holy Land, he knew exactly who could hold the empire together while he was away. Spoiler, it wasn't him, it was her. But Richard died in 1199, shot by a crossbow bolt during a siege so minor, most maps forgot it existed. The wound was treatable. His ego wasn't. He pulled the arrow out himself like a true crusader, and predictably it got infected. And then suddenly the crown passed to John. John, the youngest, the most coddled, the least prepared, a man who would go on to become the medieval version of "please stop making things worse." Where Richard had confidence, John had suspicion. Where Richard delegated to experts, John micromanaged incompetently. Where Richard trusted Elira, John never truly trusted anyone. And yet Elira had supported his claim. Not because she thought he'd make a great king, but because he was a safer bet than her grandson Arthur, a child with a fragile claim and a target painted on his back. Elira knew the rules of dynastic warfare, better a known mess than an unknown martyr. And John? He delivered exactly what she feared. Disaster. He lost Normandy. He quarreled with the church. He taxed his nobles into open rebellion. And somewhere in between, probably misplacing a crown jewel or two, he signed the Magna Carta in 1215. A document not out of nobility, but because a large number of very angry barons were pointing sharp objects at his face. He didn't honor it, of course. That would have required consistency. But the fact remains, under John, the unthinkable happened. A king was forced to concede that his power had limits, that laws could apply to him, that the crown was not an absolute. It wasn't the end of monarchy, but it was the beginning of something else. And in a twisted, historical full circle, it was Elira's own legacy. Her fierce protection of legal structure, her emphasis on documented rights, her meticulous regency, that made John's failures so obvious. Because people remembered what good rule looked like. They'd seen her do it. And now, as John bumbled from crisis to crisis, the comparisons were brutal. Elira would never. Elira would have had the barons eating out of her hand. Elira would have raised better sons. Harsh? Maybe, but not untrue. So did Elira fail? As a ruler? No. As a mother? That's trickier. She gave birth to kings, some legendary, some laughable. She raised warriors, rebels, even a usurper or two. She watched them fight, die, and in John's case, unravel nearly everything she helped build. But she also gave them tools, memory, method, majesty. Whether they used them well? That was never her promise, because Elira didn't raise puppets, she raised rulers, and rulers must make their own mistakes. Still, even in their worst decisions, even in John's scribbled signature at the bottom of a document he neither respected nor understood, you can feel her shadow, not a ghost. A foundation, because even when her sons stumbled, they walked paths she carved, and history, it remembers her steps more clearly than theirs. Now that the royal family tree has shed a few more questionable branches, let's zoom out. Let's look not at the queens and kings, but at the world they ruled. Because for all her regal triumphs and palace intrigue, Queen Elira's legacy didn't just echo in courts and chronicles. It echoed in kitchens, in convents, in muddy fields where peasants paused their plowing to whisper about the queen who once defied her husband and the Pope. Her rule, especially during those critical years as regent, did something few medieval women ever had the opportunity to do: shape the rhythm of everyday life across an entire continent. Let's start with the legal system. While Elira never drafted law codes herself, her influence nudged the men who did. During Richard's reign, and even under John's chaotic rule, the administration she quietly helped build continued functioning. Tax reforms, property laws, the growing power of written contracts. They didn't just appear, they were organized, encouraged, maintained. And when disputes arose, it was often the memory of Elira's steady hand that dictated how the courts ruled. Even nobles would argue Her Majesty wouldn't have allowed this, like it was some kind of sacred clause. That's the thing about legacy. It becomes a measuring stick. In Aquitaine, Elira's homeland, her cultural policies outlived her by decades. The courts she fostered, the ones filled with troubadours and poets and idealized love, became templates for noble behavior across Europe. Her patronage of the arts wasn't fluff, it was political, strategic. Make people sing about how noble courtship should be, and suddenly you've softened the edges of a brutally patriarchal society. Just a little, just enough. And it worked. The ideas of courtly love, of female virtue as a kind of silent power, took root. Twisted in strange directions, yes, but rooted nonetheless in a queen's effort to give women some kind of narrative space. Even the church, which had often been wary of her, grudgingly respected her discipline. After her death, bishops praised her piety, selectively forgetting the whole imprisoned by husband for inciting rebellion chapter. But history is like that. It edits. It picks its favorite quotes. Meanwhile, the common people, they told stories. The Queen of Two Kings, they called her. The Lady of Lions, the widow who rode at war. Some of the stories were wildly inaccurate. One version claimed she turned into a hawk and flew over Henry's castle during the rebellion. Another said she had a ring that could control men's minds. But in a way, those weren't exaggerations. They were translations, because when people don't have the tools to record history, they mythologize it. And that in itself is a kind of immortality. Elira didn't need statues. She had tavern songs. She didn't need sainthood. She had bedtime stories passed down by grandmothers who'd never seen a court, but knew what it meant to hold your ground. And through it all, her influence kept surfacing in strange places. In legal documents where women were granted land titles as her ladyship once decreed. In disputes where widows invoked her as precedent. If the Queen of Merovingian could lead armies, surely I can manage a vineyard. She became a symbol. Not of perfection, but of possibility. And that's rarer and stronger, because perfection fades, it becomes untouchable. But possibility, that spreads, it's contagious. So while kings rose and fell, while John lost Normandy, while the barons squabbled, while England edged closer to the chaotic brilliance of Magna Carta, Elira's blueprint held, not because she forced it, but because it worked. And in a world where most women's names were forgotten before they were buried, Elira's kept getting whispered, a little louder each time. Imagine standing in a great stone hall. The fire is low, the banners still. And on the high table, where once sat kings and queens, now lies a ledger, one that doesn't list battles or borders, but names. Just names. Because history, for all its pageantry, is just a long list of people trying to make sense of power. And Queen Elira, she mastered the game. But after the queens and kings pass, it's those whose names never made the tapestries that carry their legacy forward. The stewards, the scribes, the widows, the daughters. Let's begin with the daughters. While the Plantagenet sons tore at each other like wolves in a too small cage, Elira's daughters moved like chess pieces across Europe's dynastic board, married into noble houses not just as trophies, but as emissaries. Strategists, queens in miniature. Marie, the Countess of Champagne, Elira's oldest daughter, was no passive partner. She ran her court like a cultural greenhouse. Under her patronage, courtly love didn't just flourish, it was weaponized. Stories of noble women judging knights, of lovers pledging loyalty through virtue and verse, became a social template. Was it romantic? Occasionally. Was it political? Always. Because when men are trying to kill each other with swords, the woman who controls the poems controls the narrative. Marie wasn't alone. Elira's daughters moved through Burgundy, Castile, half Toulouse, carrying their mother's reputation like a secret seal of credibility. Other noble women began copying their models, founding abbeys, managing land, correcting bishops with very polite letters and very impolite implications. Meanwhile, back in England and France, the noble class, having survived John's awkward experiment in monarchy, was beginning to realize something profound. The queen had been the adult in the room all along. And that's when the stories started shifting. Chronicles began treating Elira with grudging awe. No longer just wife of, she became a category of her own. The Queen of Two Kings, the Lady of the Realm. In some records, she was even listed alongside male rulers in timelines, something almost unheard of. Even in death, she refused to be footnoted. But this wasn't just happening in elite circles. Peasants, tradesmen, even monks kept her memory alive. You can track her legend not through libraries, but through place names, shrines, songs passed down from mothers who'd never read a scroll in their lives, but could recite every line of the ballad about the queen who rode in armor. Of course, some versions got a little magical. There were tales that she rode a dragon, or that her crown never tarnished, even in death, or that she once silenced a courtroom by simply raising an eyebrow. A myth that, frankly, may not be myth at all. But the point isn't historical accuracy, it's historical presence. Elira remained present in minds, in memories, in the way women carried themselves across courtrooms and kitchens alike. Because her legacy wasn't only institutional, it was emotional. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, a woman didn't have to choose between power and survival, that maybe ruling wasn't a betrayal of femininity, but an expression of it. That you could be strategic and still feel, that you could mourn a son and still order a siege, that you could be both and be remembered for more than either. And for the women who came after, that changed everything. Let's be honest, after 12 parts, you're probably wondering something. How did she do it? Not just the ruling or the surviving, but the lasting, the enduring. Queen Elira isn't just a historical figure, she's an anomaly. She stayed relevant across 6 decades, multiple kingdoms, countless betrayals, and one very dramatic family feud. Most rulers get a decade, a war, a scandal. Elira got an era. And while much of that can be attributed to her intelligence, her strategy, her absurdly sharp memory for who wronged her in 1174, it's also about something else. Adaptability. Elira was, above all, a political shapeshifter. In a world that constantly tried to trap women in static roles, bride, mother, dowager, Elira refused to stay still. When she married Louis of Gauvain, she became the pious queen consort. When she married Henry of Orleans, she became the power broker. When she was imprisoned, she became the myth. And when she returned as regent, she became the storm. It wasn't just that she changed, it's that she changed on purpose. She read the room, she adjusted, she used the expectations placed on her like stepping stones across a minefield. And while men were praised for growing into their rule, women were expected to shrink into obedience. Elira did neither. She expanded strategically, ruthlessly, elegantly. That's what made her different. Not just her power, but her ability to wield it differently, depending on who was watching. To Henry, her second husband, she was the queen who bore sons and smiled politely until she raised those sons against him. To Richard, she was the trusted regent until she quietly made sure he couldn't ignore his own empire while crusading. To John, she was both blessing and curse, a mother he couldn't live up to and couldn't outmaneuver. Even the clergy didn't know what to do with her. Some called her devout, others called her dangerous. Most wisely said both and moved on. But adaptability isn't just about politics, it's about survival. And for women in medieval Europe, survival was an Olympic sport. Elira saw what happened to queens who didn't evolve. They were sidelined, erased, or worse, used as cautionary tales. Don't be like Queen so-and-so who dared to speak out. Don't be like that duchess who argued with her husband and got shipped to a convent. But Elira? She studied the rules and then rewrote them in invisible ink. She learned which battles to fight publicly and which to win behind closed doors. She played the long game, not because she lacked boldness, but because she understood endurance was the boldest move of all. And while her male contemporaries burned bright and fell fast, Elira endured, and endured, and endured. That's why centuries later, she's still being discussed. Not because of a single moment of glory, but because of 1,000 calculated choices made over decades. She didn't rule with fire or fury, but with focus. And focus? Focus burns slower, but longer. It's the difference between a torch and a lighthouse. So if you've been listening to this story thinking, but how could I ever be like her? You're asking the wrong question. You already are. If you've ever read the room before speaking, if you've ever paused before reacting, if you've ever taken a hit and then quietly rebuilt while no one was watching, congratulations. That's Elira, not the crown, not the title, the choice to persist, to adapt, to endure with elegance. That's the lesson, that's the legacy, and we're only halfway through. So let's talk about something no one likes to admit when they study history. Sometimes the people who make the biggest difference are the ones who don't get statues, or castles, or Netflix dramas. They don't win wars, or wear crowns, or even get mentioned in most textbooks. but they're there, shaping the outcome of every decision, whispering into the ears of kings, translating chaos into strategy. Queen Elira knew this better than anyone, because while she had the crown, she never ruled alone. And she made sure of that. Behind every one of her victories, every diplomatic coup, every rebellion suppressed, every legal reform, there were allies. Women and men who saw her not just as a monarch, but as a master strategist worth following. Let's start with her scribes. Yes, the nerds with ink-stained sleeves and ruined eyesight by age 30. These people were her lifeline. Elira dictated letters like she was playing 5D chess. She corresponded across Europe, maintaining a web of alliances that made even seasoned diplomats sweat. And her scribes weren't just transcribers, they were trusted extensions of her voice. She chose them carefully, trained them brutally, and demanded they write exactly what she meant. A single misplaced word, that could spark war. So you'd better believe she proofread. Then there were the ladies of her court. Forget modern ladies-in-waiting stereotypes. Elira's court wasn't a salon full of embroidery and sighing. It was a war room in velvet. These women were sharp, multilingual, politically trained. She brought in noble women with brains, not just bloodlines. Women who could manage estates, send coded messages, or broker a truce over wine like it was girls' night at Versailles. Some of them were widows, others unmarried by choice. A few were nuns on leave, brought in not for piety but for their connections to powerful abbeys. Together they made up what historians now call informal power networks. At the time, they were just called dangerous, because when smart women start talking to each other, people get nervous. And then there were the knights. Yes, Elira had knights. Not just the kind who polished their swords and posed dramatically in courtyards, but men who had pledged themselves to her, not just the crown. She kept a loyal contingent of warriors, many from her Aquitanian homeland, who had fought for her during the rebellion against Henry, and then again during her regency. These men weren't just muscle, they were message. Every time one of Elira's armored captains rode into a tense negotiation, it reminded people, she can still call an army if she needs to, and sometimes that was all she needed to win. Even her enemies played a role, because power, like storytelling, often depends on the existence of a villain. And Elira had a rogues gallery. Barons who underestimated her, bishops who tried to sideline her, chroniclers who tried to erase her. She outlived most of them, and those she didn't outlive, she outmaneuvered. But perhaps the most underrated part of Elira's success was her ability to listen. She had spies, yes, but more than that, she had ears in every corner of her empire. She listened to merchants, to abbots, to angry nobles and grieving mothers. She didn't just want to rule from a throne, she wanted to understand what people whispered about after the candles were out, because that's where revolts start, and that's where loyalty is born. So no, Elira didn't succeed because she was some kind of medieval superwoman. She succeeded because she shared power, carefully, strategically, and often invisibly. She built a coalition, not just a court, and that's why she endured. Because when you rule alone, you die alone. But when you lift others with you, you become something bigger than memory, become momentum. Power doesn't just echo, it leaves fingerprints, sometimes on treaties, sometimes on bodies, and sometimes, quite literally, on the walls of castles and the edges of forgotten manuscripts. By the time Elira was in her final decade, the landscape of her world, politically, culturally, even architecturally, had begun to mirror her methods. If the early medieval period was a rough sketch, her rule added bold lines, shaded detail, and occasional bloodstains. Let's start with something deceptively simple: communication. Before Elira's era, royal correspondence was slow, inconsistent, and riddled with personal feuds between scribes and writers. It wasn't so much a system as it was a long, noble game of did you get my letter or not. But under her oversight, especially during Richard's absence and John's Johnness, things changed. She standardized reporting across her holdings. Royal messages began to include specific protocols, who could write them, how they should be delivered, how quickly action was expected. Her word became a kind of lightning rod, powerful, precise, and undeniably hers. The scribal class, once seen as little more than glorified note-takers, became instruments of administration. Some even rose to minor nobility, because under Elira, if you held her seal, you held sway. That mattered. A lot, but governance isn't all ink and wax. Sometimes it's bricks. Elira's building projects were subtle, but brilliant. Unlike kings who built towers to show off, she focused on fortifications with purpose. River crossings were reinforced. Remote border estates were stocked and refortified, not for show, but for survival. Hospitals were expanded. Abbeys were strategically funded. It was the medieval equivalent of installing Wi-Fi, plumbing, and a security system all at once. And it worked. When famine hit regions around Toulouse, her granaries kept hunger at bay. When tensions flared in Brittany, her roads kept troops moving and merchants calm. She wasn't just building for her reign, she was future-proofing her empire. And the culture? By now you know about the troubadours and courtly love. But let's take it further. Under Elira's patronage, art began to move beyond flat halos and sad saints. Illuminated manuscripts from her court show queens holding swords, women weighing justice, allegorical figures who weren't afraid to do things, not just represent them. These weren't mistakes. They were permission. Artists under her influence were quietly saying, "We see you. We remember what power can look like in a woman's hands." And then that permission spread. Across noble households, women started collecting books, not just religious texts, but philosophy, even early legal codes. Literacy among noble women, still rare but growing, was no longer just for prayer. It was for politics. It was how they stayed in the game. Because once you can read a land deed, it's a lot harder for someone to steal it from you. And Elira, she made sure they had something to read. Her court produced one of the earliest anthologies of Occitan poetry written by women. Yes, female troubadours, trobarits, who weren't just singing about chivalry, but about ambition, disappointment, freedom. Women who, like their queen, had no patience for being passive. So yes, by her final years, Elira wasn't just a political figure. She was an institution. You could govern in her name, quote her in debates, defend policy by asking, would the Queen of Two Crowns have done differently? Because even the answer didn't matter half as much as the question. It meant people remembered, and remembered correctly. Not as myth, but as method. Let's step into the silence. Not the dramatic, torchlit kind where someone's about to be betrayed, but the kind that comes after. After the court has disbanded, after the laws have been passed, after the queen has drawn her last breath. Because now, we enter the long echo. Queen Elira died in 1204, entombed in stone, her legacy supposedly sealed alongside her. But what came next was not an ending. It was a reckoning, a slow-burning recognition that the world had just lost its compass. And you know what happens when the compass disappears? People start walking in circles. The most obvious spiral was political. John, still king, still floundering, still wondering if total collapse with a viable governing strategy did not rise to meet the moment. With Elira gone, he lost not just a mother, but a shield, a strategist, a voice in the dark who could talk him down from disaster. Now there was only the dark. He fell into it. By 1215, just over a decade after her death, John was cornered at Runnymede by his barons. The Magna Carta was forced into existence, not because the barons suddenly believed in liberty, but because without Elira, they knew they could push, and push they did. But let's be clear, Elira didn't just leave a political vacuum. She left a cultural one. You could feel it in the courts. Before, when noble women debated property rights or inheritance, they could point to her. The queen ruled Aquitaine for decades. Now their arguments had lost their trump card. It became harder to convince skeptical bishops that a woman's judgment was valid, harder to win over judges who no longer saw queenship as a precedent, harder to remind poets that women could lead epics, not just inspire them. Because Elira wasn't just a ruler, she was proof. And when proof dies, people forget faster than you'd think. Still, not everyone forgot. In convents and courts, in trade guilds and family estates, small flames stayed lit. Women passed on her story like a secret recipe. Your great-grandmother met her once. She gave a sermon with the bishop and won. She forgave her son, but never forgot. Legends, yes, but legends with just enough truth to spark curiosity. And then came the next generation, women who had never seen her rule, but had grown up in its afterglow. They began to piece together her memory, not from official scrolls, but from stories whispered while spinning wool or grinding herbs. In some abbeys, her name was invoked during debates. In one particularly gutsy legal case, a noblewoman referenced Elira's regency as precedent to claim guardianship over her daughter's estate, and won. Why? Because the clerk remembered. He'd been a scribe in her court. He knew her signature. He'd once watched her correct a noble's grammar mid-argument and still win the land dispute. People like him, quiet, aging, invisible, carried the torch. And because of them, Elira's legacy slipped past the blackout curtain of history. It flickered in law, in letters, in the fact that a century later, when another English queen dared to assert authority, someone said, well, it's not as if she's the first. That's the thing about true legacy. It doesn't scream. It murmurs. Through generations, through gestures, through the quiet power of being remembered accurately, not as flawless, not as myth, but as a woman who bent history, not with force, but with focus. She left the stage, but the spotlight, it didn't go out. Every queen leaves behind something. Some leave behind war, others, peace. A few, mostly the unlucky ones, leave behind unmarked graves and unfinished poems. But Queen Elira, she left behind an empire-sized question mark. What happens when a woman rules better than the men who come after her? Because let's be honest, Elira set the bar high. So high, in fact, that future queens wouldn't just be compared to their husbands or fathers, they'd be compared to her. And whether they liked it or not, she became the blueprint. Which brings us to the women who came next. First, the royal ones. Eleanor of Castile, Isabella of France, Philippa of Hainault, all of them marriage with expectations already warped by Elira's legacy. They were expected to be diplomatic, educated, culturally sophisticated, and when necessary, terrifying. Isabella of France, married to Edward II, who made John look competent by comparison, eventually led a rebellion against her husband. Sound familiar? It should. She even brought a foreign army. And while Isabella's legacy is still debated, one thing is certain: she had studied Elira's playbook, and she wasn't the only one. By the late 13th century, the idea of a political queen was no longer scandalous. It was expected. Queens were supposed to manage courts, advise kings, even govern in their absence. The shift wasn't sudden. It was slow, uneven, messy, but it was real, and Elira had nudged it into motion. Then there were the non-royal women, abbesses who ran communities larger than towns, noble women who brokered peace between warring houses, merchants' wives who quietly built trade empires under their husbands' names and sometimes over their objections. These women didn't quote Elira. They didn't need to. She had already normalized competence, already legitimized female authority, already made space where none had existed. And this ripple effect, it wasn't limited to gender. Elira's reign changed how people thought about rulership itself. The idea that legitimacy came not just from birthright, but from action. That leadership wasn't about who shouted loudest, but who listened longest. That a ruler didn't need to be adored, just respected and ideally feared. That governance could be intelligent, meticulous, and deeply human. These weren't just personal values, they were political strategies. And over time, they spread, not just through royal courts, but through guilds, universities, parliaments. Even the church, that bastion of medieval masculinity, began to shift, slowly. Women's convents gained prestige. Female saints were canonized not just for martyrdom, but for wisdom. The Virgin Mary went from symbol to strategy, used in sermons to justify female intervention in earthly affairs. All of this was part of a larger realignment, a recognition that power, when wielded by women, didn't cause collapse. It caused change, and Elira was the prototype. She didn't break the system. She rewrote it line by line until the next generation mistook her revisions for tradition, which frankly is how you know it worked. Because the most lasting revolutions aren't the ones that burn the palace. They're the ones where the palace starts looking different, and no one remembers when it changed. Now let's dim the lights on Europe for just a moment and look at something even bigger. The idea of legacy, not in ink or architecture, but in how we remember power. Because Elira, more than most monarchs, didn't just rule in her time, she haunted the centuries that followed. And haunting, that's an art. You see, not all legends are born in war. Some are built through contradiction. Elira was both devout and defiant, both royal and rebellious, both a mother and a monarch in a world where being either was hard enough, and that tension between duty and danger, tradition and defiance is what made her unforgettable. It's why people couldn't stop talking about her, even when they tried, even when the next kings tried to push her to the footnotes. Because Elira wasn't just a person, she became a question. How far can a woman go before history shuts the door behind her? And how do you reopen that door centuries later when the dust of patriarchy has settled like stone? Answer: you don't knock. You find the old hinges and you pry. That's what historians, writers, and artists did, again and again, each time they rediscovered Elira's story. In the 14th century, a French chronicler stumbled across her letters and couldn't believe a queen had once negotiated with popes like an equal. He wrote her off as unusual. Translation: I'm threatened, so I'll use academic language. In the 16th century, during a wave of Tudor nostalgia, Elira was briefly rebranded as a Proto-English heroine. Never mind that she was more French than frog legs. By the 19th century, the Romantics had a field day. They painted her in flowing gowns, gazing wistfully from castle windows, because nothing says badass queen like turning her into a melancholic wallpaper model. And yet, despite the misreadings, she endured, because even a distorted portrait is proof someone mattered. Fast forward to today, and Elira still refuses to vanish. Historical fiction authors can't resist her. She's the perfect storm of romance, rebellion, and ruthlessness. Academics, too, digging into court records, parsing her Latin correspondence, arguing over whether she really controlled armies or just influenced those who did. Spoiler, she did both. Meanwhile, screenwriters circle her like hawks, because, let's be honest, this woman had more plot twists than a Game of Thrones spinoff. And viewers? Listeners like you? You're here, which means Elira won again. She outlasted them all. She became more than history. She became narrative, a living, breathing part of how we talk about ambition. She made it possible to imagine a medieval woman who wasn't merely tragic or victimized or sainted out of relevance. She made it possible to imagine power in female form, not borrowed, not accidental, but designed. And that imagination, it's everything. Because once a story like that enters the bloodstream of culture, it doesn't just stay in textbooks. It changes what little girls dream about. It changes what adults expect. It changes who gets remembered next. So no, Elira didn't write history with a sword or a sermon. She wrote it with presence, and centuries later, we're still reading. Let's talk about regrets. Not hers. We don't know if Elira had any. She never left behind a diary with the medieval equivalent of, maybe I shouldn't have married that 17-year-old the second time. But the people around her, the kings who followed, the nobles who watched her climb, survive, and outmaneuver, oh, they had regrets. Because the moment she was gone, the seams started unraveling. And that's the thing about someone who keeps the machine running. You don't appreciate the grease until the gears start grinding. Take King John. He lived another dozen years after Elira's death, and he spent most of that time trying to outrun her ghost. Not literally, though we wouldn't put it past him to have installed a holy relic or two just in case. But figuratively, absolutely. Every time he made a bad decision, and there were many, people whispered, Elira wouldn't have done that. Every failed negotiation, every rebel baron, every time he sulked instead of ruled. Her memory became a ruler's worst nightmare, a mirror held up to his flaws. And outside the palace, it was worse. Noblewomen began invoking her name in legal disputes. Queen Elira held land in her own right. Why can't I? Queen Elira managed her son's kingdom while he was away. Surely I can manage my late husband's estate. Suddenly, she wasn't just a figure from history. She was a legal argument, a feminist footnote before the term even existed. And not everyone was thrilled. Some clergy called her dangerous. Some chroniclers tried to downplay her influence. One even wrote that she distracted kings with her cleverness. Imagine being so competent that centuries later your competence is labeled a distraction. But try as they might, they couldn't erase her. Because people remembered. They remembered the stability under her regency, the peace deals she brokered, the rebellions she managed without burning half the country to the ground. They remembered the queen who didn't ask for permission, just precision. And precision? That's hard to undo. Even architecture bore her name. Manor houses built during her lifetime featured female heraldry carved above doors, lionesses, lilies, scrolls. These weren't decorative, they were defiant. They said, a woman ruled here, and it worked. And it wasn't just England or Aquitaine. Elira's legacy crossed borders. In Castile, queens began demanding co-rule. In the Holy Roman Empire, noblewomen used her story as precedent to act as regents. In Italian city-states, her strategies were studied by ambitious merchant families who understood that gender mattered less than results. She became a model for power that was quiet when needed, loud when necessary, and undeniable always. And her story? It didn't stay in courts. It slipped into songs, plays, like even saint stories, though she was never canonized. She probably would have rolled her eyes at the idea. So, do we know if Elira had regrets? No, but we know what she left behind. A generation of rulers who couldn't live up to her, a legacy that refused to shrink, a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing a woman can leave is a standard. So, now she's gone. The throne is cold, the corridors echo with footsteps that aren't hers, and kingdoms, yes, plural, must learn how to breathe without their iron lungs. You'd think her death would bring closure, a nice clean chapter ending. But Queen Elira, she never gave anyone that luxury because while her body rested in Fontevraud, her presence refused to stay buried. That's the thing about ruling as a woman in a man's world. You don't just fight to live, you fight to be remembered, not just as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as someone, as a force, a center of gravity no historian can ignore. And Elira, she was unforgettable, even when they tried. You see, after she died in 1204, there was a kind of collective royal sigh of relief. No more carefully worded letters, no more political chess moves masked as courtly suggestions. No more queen who remembered who betrayed her in 1173 and how much wheat Aquitaine exported that winter. But relief quickly turned into regret, because things didn't work without her. King John, her most chaotic child, spiraled. With Elira gone, there was no one left to shield him from himself. No one to temper his paranoia. No one to whisper, "Don't insult the barons today, they haven't had breakfast yet." And when the Magna Carta rolled around in 1215, it was less about freedom and more about nobles finally cornering a monarch who'd misplaced both his mother and his sense. Meanwhile, the people began remembering, not the pageantry, but the function, the boring brilliance of things working, crops that reached market, roads that stayed open, laws that didn't contradict themselves mid-sentence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was memorable, and it had Elira's fingerprints all over it. You started to see it in the small things. Merchants citing trade policies she established, noblewomen invoking her regency to argue legal standing. Even abbots who once grumbled about her now spoke of her judgment like scripture. Because once you've seen a woman hold an empire together, you start to question why more aren't allowed to try. And artists? Oh, they had a field day. Troubadours turned her life into legend. Songs about the queen who rode like a knight, judged like a king, and forgave like a saint. Unless, of course, you crossed her. Then she forgave you with land confiscations and excommunication. Dramatists added flair. They gave her dragons. They gave her secret twin daughters. One version claims she faked her death and still ruled from a monastery in disguise. All nonsense, obviously. But the fact that they wanted it to be true? That tells you everything. Even the poets were trying to keep her alive. Because without her, ruling suddenly seemed less impressive. Every queen who followed her, Isabella, Philippa, Anne, had to measure herself against a shadow. "She's no Elira," they'd whisper. Or, well, Elira would have handled it differently. The comparisons weren't always fair, but they were unavoidable, because Elira wasn't just a ruler, she was a standard. Even male rulers weren't immune. Henry III's counselors pored over her correspondence for examples of good governance. Louis X of France asked about her diplomatic style, and whispers of her method, patient, observant, devastatingly precise, floated through the corridors of power like perfume you couldn't place but couldn't ignore. She became institutional memory. She became precedent. She became uncomfortably a mirror, especially for kings who inherited her systems but not her sense. And while statues weren't built for her, not yet, the weight of her legacy was heavier than stone. It sat on laws, it whispered from letters, it lingered in every woman who dared sit at a council table without apologizing first. Because even if they didn't name her, they felt her. The expectation that they could, and should, be competent. That they could make decisions without asking permission. That they had a place at the table not as ornaments, but as strategists. And if someone objected, they had a name to invoke, Elira. No longer just a queen, now a warning, now a lesson, now a quiet, powerful refusal to disappear. because history only forgets you if you let it. And Elira, she never let go. Let's talk about endings, not the kind with swelling orchestras and slow fades to black, not the fantasy kind where a queen dies and the kingdom blooms in her memory. No, we're talking about real endings, messy, slow, bureaucratic, the kind filled with paperwork, questionable successors, and the haunting sound of someone whispering, "Remember when she was still alive?" Because Queen Elira didn't leave a void. She left a crater, and everyone left behind had to figure out how to build civilization around it. The first to fail spectacularly? Her son, King John. Without his mother breathing strategic sense into his court like a human firewall, John made every bad decision with remarkable speed. He alienated allies. He taxed the wrong nobles. He forgot that a throne only works if people believe in the person sitting on it. And John? Well, no one believed because they remembered. They remembered Elira's regency, how she kept the empire stable when Richard was off crusading. They remembered how she juggled foreign relations with a grip firm enough to bend steel. They remembered that when she ruled, things worked. And memory? Memory is poison to mediocrity. It haunted John. The barons who once feared her now scoffed at him. The advisors who once bent to her will now rolled their eyes behind his back. Even his enemies, men who once trembled at the sound of her title, couldn't summon the same fear for her floundering heir. And when John tried to rule like her, issuing decrees, negotiating alliances, projecting strength, he failed. Because imitation without insight is theater. And Elira? She never acted. She was. By the time John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, Elira's shadow loomed so large it may as well have signed it for him. Because that document, it wasn't about progress, it was about damage control. The barons weren't envisioning liberty. They were trying to survive a world where the adult had left the room and the toddler had stolen the crown. But her impact wasn't just political, it was cultural. Women, noble women especially, began citing her in legal cases. Elira managed land independently. Elira negotiated with the Pope. Elira led during war. She became a legal footnote, a feminist citation centuries before feminism had a name. And it drove certain men absolutely mad. They rewrote chronicles, downplayed her victories, questioned her morality, the usual tactics, because if you can't outshine her, you might as well throw dirt and hope it sticks. Spoiler, it didn't, because the people remembered. In songs, in stories, in stained glass windows that featured her coat of arms beside her son's. Even in manuscripts, many written decades later, that still referred to her not as consort, but as sovereign. And the church? They had to adjust because Elira had supported religious institutions. She'd built abbeys, funded education, corresponded with popes, but she'd also kept priests in check. And that made her hard to canonize, but impossible to ignore. So they praised her as devout, wise, and most importantly, a model of Christian queenship, which is medieval code for, we don't know what to do with this terrifyingly competent woman, but we'd like to stay on her good side, just in case she comes back. Even architecture bore her legacy. Fortresses she'd ordered rebuilt with better walls and cleverer defenses, roads widened for trade, bridges that bore her initials in carved stone, places where her influence lingered, quite literally etched into the bones of the land. You could walk through Aquitaine and feel her. In how people negotiated, in how women spoke, in how power wasn't just wielded, it was earned. She had set a precedent that queens didn't have to be saints or symbols. They could be rulers, operators, architects of nations, and every woman who dared to rule after her, whether she said it aloud or not, walked the path Elira carved. So yes, this was an ending, but not a fade to black kind, more like a smolder. Because when Queen Elira died, she didn't vanish, she diffused. Into the systems, into the stories, into the stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, leadership had less to do with gender and more to do with grit. And if that belief survived the medieval world, then maybe, just maybe, Elira never really left. We're nearing the edge of the story now. But before we end, let's take one last look at the world Queen Elira left behind. Not just the kingdoms, but the atmosphere. The temperature. The subtle shift in what people thought was possible. Because the true mark of a ruler isn't just what they build, it's what remains. And what remained after Elira was a kind of recalibration. For over 60 years, she'd shaped the way people understood leadership. Now, without her, everyone had to redefine what ruling looked like. And to their dismay, They found themselves using her as the default, even if they didn't admit it, especially if they didn't admit it. In council meetings, courtiers compared new policies to hers. In legal disputes, scribes dug through her old edicts. Even merchants referenced how things were done under the queen's regency. She became a yardstick. And unfortunately for her successors, most of them came up short. King John, her son, had already begun to falter even before her death. But afterward, the decline was undeniable. Without her balancing influence, his court descended into chaos. His paranoia deepened, his cruelty sharpened, and the nobility, tired of royal tantrums, began whispering the unthinkable. She was the real king. That wasn't meant as flattery. It was a fact, because she had ruled more decisively, more consistently, and more competently than most of the men who ever wore the crown. And that truth lingered like smoke. You couldn't touch it, but you couldn't escape it either. Elira became the standard, both inspiring and damning. Every female ruler after her was compared to her legacy. Every male ruler lived in her shadow, and the comparisons were rarely kind. But the real power of her legacy wasn't in politics alone. It was in memory. Generations after her death, storytellers began to reshape her, sometimes as a mother saint, sometimes as a scheming villainess, sometimes as both. Because when a woman has too much power, history doesn't know where to put her, so it keeps redrawing the portrait. But in every version, one thing remained the same. She mattered. That alone was revolutionary, because for most medieval queens, legacy was survival. A few lines in a chronicle, a name in a charter, a face in a stained glass window labeled wife of. But Elira? She got chapters, she got footnotes, she got cited. By the 14th century, her name appeared in legal handbooks, monastic letters, and noble family trees. Even her detractors couldn't erase her. One chronicler tried to dismiss her reign by saying she meddled in men's affairs. Another called her formidable, which in medieval Latin is basically a passive-aggressive compliment. But still they wrote about her, because silence would have been worse. Silence would have made them irrelevant. And that's the twist. She didn't need their approval, just their acknowledgement, because as long as her name was spoken, grudgingly, admiringly, fearfully, she had won. And while others were forgotten between battles and borders, Elira endured. She became a lesson, a cautionary tale for those who feared powerful women, a beacon for those who dreamed of becoming one. And in time, she stopped being just a queen. She became a legacy machine, the kind whose story travels farther than her crown ever did. So as her name drifted across centuries, between scripts, songs, and side-eyed comparisons, one thing became clear. She didn't just rule her world. She rewrote the rules for everyone after. By now, you're probably wondering, how long can a queen's influence really last? 1 generation? Maybe 2? Not Elira. Her legacy didn't just echo. It embedded, like a watermark beneath every parchment, a faint outline in the political DNA of Europe. You couldn't always see it. But when things went wrong, people started looking for it. And more often than not, they found themselves saying, well, what would Elira have done? Which is hilarious if you think about it. Because in her lifetime, plenty of men wished she'd just stayed quiet. Married well, managed embroidery. Instead, she managed empires. And now, those same empires were scrambling to recreate what she'd built, usually without her skills, but with her memory as a blueprint. Let's get specific. In the early 13th century, just a few years after her death, Elira's reforms in Aquitaine outlived her by decades. Tax structures she implemented were still in place. Property records she ordered were still being used. Her emphasis on documentation, it turned local administration from a guessing game into a process. That's not legacy, that's infrastructure. And when people realized things were falling apart, roads deteriorating, markets failing, councils bickering, what did they do? They quoted her letters. They reissued her policies. One chronicler even wrote, "It is as though she had foreseen these failures and prepared instructions from beyond the grave." That chronicler, not even a fan. But respect, oh, it was there. Meanwhile, the nobility was having its own reckoning. Because while Elira had elevated the role of noble women, educating them, involving them in governance, even training them in diplomacy, many of their male relatives wanted to reverse course, put the genie back in the bottle. Spoiler, didn't work. Because the daughters of Elira's court had grown up watching their queen settle disputes and run councils, and you don't unsee that. They pushed back. They refused to be sidelined. They quoted her, sometimes verbatim. Even her critics couldn't help but admit they have inherited not just her blood, but her stubbornness. Exactly. And then there was the church. Tricky relationship, that one. Elira had always walked the line, pious but pragmatic. She built monasteries, but also questioned bishops. She prayed, but she also negotiated with popes like she was haggling over livestock, which frankly she kind of was. But even the church couldn't deny her effectiveness. After her death, several abbots cited her as a model of Christian rulership. Strong in virtue, wise in counsel, humble in victory. Flattering? Sure. Accurate? Mostly. Strategic? Definitely. Because by canonizing her image, if not her person, they kept her close. And in doing so, they reinforced her legacy in ways her enemies never anticipated. But maybe the most fascinating part? How ordinary people remembered her. Not in polished Latin scrolls or royal genealogies, but in stories, market gossip, family lore. The servant who once saw her correct a knight's map, the widow whose land dispute she settled fairly, the soldier whose entire career started with her letter of recommendation. She wasn't just a queen to them, she was the queen. And in a world where most monarchs became myths, Elira became memory, lived in, shared, spoken of like someone you might still meet if you went to the right village at the right time of day. That's the kind of legacy no statue can match, because memory lives in breath. And Elira, she never stopped breathing. Let's shift focus now, not from Elira, but from the people around her. Because a legacy isn't just what you build, it's what others do with it. And in Elira's case, her influence spread like ivy, slow, deliberate, quietly unstoppable, especially among the women. It's tempting to think her story ended with the crown being passed down, court records filed, and life moving on. But in truth, that was just the beginning. Because while kings ruled by decree, Elira had ruled by example. And examples? They ripple. Take her daughters-in-law, the women who married into her bloodline expected to play background roles, ornaments to royal politics. But when they arrived in court, they stepped into a world Elira had already reshaped. The expectations had changed. They were expected to be useful, fluent in diplomacy, comfortable in council chambers, capable of managing estates. And why? Because Elira had made it the norm. Suddenly, being merely beautiful or obedient wasn't enough. The Queen Mother had set the curve, and every woman in court was now being graded on it. Some rose to the challenge, others collapsed beneath it, but none escaped it. And in no noble houses across France and England, the same thing happened. Young women were educated, not just in scripture or sewing, but in estate law, inheritance rights, and even rhetoric. They were reading poetry by women, legal documents written by women, even sermons about women. All of this? Elira's echo, because during her reign, she hadn't just wielded power, she had modeled it. In every decision she made, she gave permission. Permission to question, to lead, to remember. That last one is key, because even generations later, when her name stopped appearing in official documents, it kept popping up in the margins. A noblewoman requesting a land audit, as was done under Queen Elira. A nun citing her letters in a lesson on logic. A merchant's daughter signing her name with a flourish that mirrored Elira's royal mark. The influence was subtle, but unmistakable, and it reached places even she might not have imagined. In Italian city-states, merchant guilds adopted negotiation strategies rooted in her treaties. In Spain, court poets crafted female characters inspired by her wit and defiance. In northern France, abbesses organized councils in her model, structured, firm, spiritually anchored, but deeply practical. Even in England, where John's reign left a bitter taste, Elira's memory offered an antidote. At least she knew what she was doing, people said. Sometimes bitterly, sometimes wistfully, always truthfully. Because competence leaves a mark deeper than love or fear. It creates benchmarks, it changes what people expect. And Elira had done that so thoroughly, so effectively, that even her absence felt instructional. When things went wrong, people asked, what would Elira have prevented? When things went right, they whispered, she would have been proud. That's not nostalgia, that's governance by ghost. She wasn't haunting the halls, she was shaping them still. So no, she didn't vanish, she multiplied in ideas, in expectations, in women who centuries later didn't know her name, but walked through doors she had quietly kicked open long before they arrived. That's the kind of power no crown can hold. It's the kind that lives in memory and changes the world one whispered what if at a time. History often ends with a period, a date, a death, a conclusion in neat calligraphy. But Elira's story doesn't end like that, because real legacy, the kind that reshapes generations, doesn't obey punctuation. It lingers, it complicates, it mutates in memory until it's no longer just history, it's inheritance. And if you look closely, you can still see her fingerprints on the way power moves today. Let's start with the obvious. Modern queens and heads of state, those who've dared to lead, to stand alone, to write laws rather than be written about, they walk paths Elira helped pave. Not because she wrote a manifesto, not because she gave a speech, but because she existed, unapologetically, in power for over 6 decades, and people remembered. Every woman who sits at a cabinet table today owes a silent nod to Elira's stubborn refusal to sit in the background. Every female diplomat who negotiates across cultures, she's echoing a queen who once balanced English, French, Aquitanian, and church politics with the precision of a surgeon. And no, these women may not name her. They don't have to. Legacy doesn't need a credit line to be felt, but it doesn't stop with world leaders. Elira's aftershocks show up in the everyday, in the classroom where a girl challenges her teacher, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. In the office where a woman leads with clarity and patience, knowing full well she'll be called too much before she's called right. In the quiet moment when someone reads about a medieval queen and realizes, wait, they let her do all that? Because realization is the beginning of redefinition, and redefinition is power. But here's where it gets really interesting. Elira's story doesn't just change how we see women, it changes how we see rulership. She didn't rule with brute strength or divine intimidation. She ruled with strategy, with memory, with consistency so sharp it cut through centuries of male chaos like a whetstone. She showed that governance could be competent. And once you've seen competence, it's hard to settle for anything less. So even today in boardrooms or parliaments or university departments, when someone quietly says, let's take a step back and actually think this through, that's Elira's legacy humming in the walls. The idea that power isn't about volume, it's about value. That leadership isn't measured by how many people bow, but by how many stand taller because you led them. And perhaps most powerfully, Elira never asked for approval. She took her role seriously, not because others gave it to her, but because she knew she was capable. That kind of self-awareness, it's nuclear. It explodes backward through time, rewriting what we thought possible for women of her era. And it explodes forward, offering a blueprint for anyone, regardless of gender, who wants to lead with integrity. So no, Elira's story doesn't end with her tomb. It doesn't end with John. It doesn't end with the century. It pulses beneath the skin of every generation that asks the quiet, dangerous question: what if the person best suited to rule didn't look like the person we expected? That question, that's hers. Still echoing, still unfolding, still rewriting endings into beginnings. And here we are, the final stretch. The end of the path that began not with a coronation or a battle, but with a girl. Sharp-eyed, underestimated, married off too young, walking into a world that had no room for her, and deciding to carve one anyway. Let's not romanticize it. Elira's life wasn't a fairy tale. It was brutal, brilliant, calculated, and at times unbearably lonely. She survived war, betrayal, imprisonment, political exile, and an endless parade of men who assumed she'd stay silent. She didn't. She endured. She engineered her survival into sovereignty. And the result? 60 years of rule. Not reign. Rule. That careful, exhausting verb that doesn't just mean sitting on a throne, but showing up every day, sharpening policies, outsmarting rivals, and never letting anyone see you bleed. She turned power into practice, and practice into legacy. But now we close the curtain, so the question becomes, what do we do with Elira? Not just as a queen, or a mother, or a historical curiosity, but as a presence that refuses to vanish. We remember her, not because she was flawless, but because she wasn't. She made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, overextended herself. At times, she was too proud, too cautious, too relentless. But perfection was never the point. Possibility was, because Elira made space where none existed, for women, for governance, for a different kind of power, the kind that listens more than it commands, that builds instead of conquers, that bends but does not break. She showed us that leadership could be thoughtful, methodical, human, and still absolutely terrifying to anyone who relied on chaos to stay in charge. And in doing so, she didn't just change her era, she changed the story we tell about eras like hers. Because if a woman like Elira could rise in a world built to suppress her, what other stories have we missed? What other names were scrubbed from the scrolls because they ruled too well to be ignored, but not loudly enough to be remembered? Elira is a signal flare. She reminds us to look deeper, to ask better questions, to expect more, and most of all, to never let the silence of history convince us that power always looked the same, because it didn't. It looked like her, a woman with ink-stained fingers and battlefield eyes, a queen who took no thrones by storm, but held them by sheer force of intellect and will, a monarch whose greatest weapon wasn't her army or her alliances, it was her memory of what the world had been and what it could become. So tonight, as we close the book on Queen Elira, let's not bow, let's nod, quietly, respectfully, the way you do when you recognize a master at work, because Elira, she wasn't just a ruler of her time, she was time, measured not in battles won, but in systems changed, and we're still living in the shadow of her signature. You've made it. All 25 parts, every twist of fate, every whispered corridor of power, every moment Queen Elira stood her ground when the world told her to yield. And now the echoes are quieting. You've walked with her through storms and triumphs, through the silence of prison walls and the roar of council halls, through ink-stained letters and the hush of history. It's time to let the story settle. You don't have to hold it all at once. You can just let it drift. Let the candlelight of her memory soften in your mind, flickering gently behind your eyes. Let the thrones and banners and courtly shadows melt into something slower, safer. The weight of her crown is gone now. The corridors are empty. The map is rolled up, the kingdom sleeps, and so should you. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. There's no war to win tonight, no treaty to sign, just the steady hum of your breath and the knowledge that you've wandered through centuries and come home again. Elira did what few could do. She ruled wisely and fiercely and fully, and now she rests. So can you, because her world is at peace, and yours can be too. Let the pages turn softly behind your mind. Let the quiet fold over you like a warm cloak. You've heard the story, you've felt the weight of her name, and now it's time to release it. Let it become a part of your dreams, gentle and unhurried. You are safe, you are still, you are home. End of script. Sleep well.